What if the end of the world as we know it is made in America? The greatest division in modern history is not happening in some distant country, but right in the heart of the world's only superpower. The idea of a second civil war or separation is no longer just quiet speculation. It has become a growing discussion at the center of public debate, where many Americans see the other side as an existential threat to the nation. Since the end of World War II, the global order has relied on America's power as a constant fact: economic, military, and cultural. But what if this fact is not constant at all? This is not a science fiction scenario. It is an analysis of the real cracks that have started to appear in the foundations of the American Union. We will look closely at the political, economic, and geographic factors that could push this giant toward fragmentation. And we will outline in detail how new states might emerge from such a collapse and how the world could look the next day. The map you know may soon be very different. To understand how a building can collapse, we must examine the cracks in its foundation. The foundation of the American Union is under immense pressure from four main fault lines. First, the political and cultural fault line. This divide goes deeper than politics. It is a division of identity. According to studies by the Pew Research Center, a majority of both Republicans and Democrats now see the opposing party as a threat to the nation's well-being. When more than half of the population believes that the other half represents an existential danger, the foundation of mutual trust crumbles. The rise of figures such as Donald Trump was not the cause, but rather the result and an accelerator of this division. He legitimized the idea that federal institutions no longer represent the so-called real people. Second, the economic fault line. There are two Americas living in separate realities. On the coasts lie the centers of global wealth, the engineers of Silicon Valley, the financiers of Wall Street, and the creators of Hollywood. California's economy alone produces a GDP of over $3.8 trillion. If it were an independent nation, it would rank as the world's fifth largest economy, surpassing both India and the United Kingdom. Inland, however, lies the so-called Rust Belt. The cities of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan. Their residents are factory workers who watched their jobs move overseas. Data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that states like Ohio and Michigan have lost hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs since the late 1970s. This deep sense of betrayal and anger is fueling the political divide. Third, the geographic and climate fault line. Here we find a factor often overlooked. America's geography itself could become the ultimate trigger. Picture this scenario. A catastrophic drought strikes the Southwest, igniting real water wars between states. At the same time, a Category 5 hurricane devastates the Gulf Coast, and a federal government, paralyzed by political division, fails to mount an effective response. At that moment, secession would no longer seem like an extreme idea, but rather a necessity for survival. Fourth, the movements for actual independence. This is not mere speculation. The seeds of secession are already being planted. In Texas, the Texas nationalist movement is pushing for a referendum on independence. Recent polls, such as those conducted by the University of Houston, show that support for secession has at times reached nearly 40% among Republican voters. In California, the Calixit movement appears and reappears. In the Pacific Northwest, the idea of Cascadia persists. These movements, once confined to the margins, are now finding more receptive audiences than ever before. So, if what the world fears most were to happen, and America divided, how might the potential map look based on the geopolitical conflicts we have witnessed in recent years? First, the Republic of California, or the Pacifica Alliance. This would include California, Oregon, and Washington, with a combined GDP that could exceed $5 trillion, larger than the economy of Japan. This state would be a global liberal power in technology, climate policy, and entertainment. However, it would face a serious water and energy crisis. Second, the Republic of Texas, comprising Texas and possibly Oklahoma and Louisiana. It would be an energy superpower, as Texas alone produces more than 40% of U.S. oil. Militarily, it would be formidable, hosting over 136,000 active U.S. military personnel today. Third, the Republic of Florida, or the Gulf Coast Union, including Florida and potentially Alabama and Georgia. Its strength would lie in maritime trade and tourism. Its strategic location would control trade routes to the Caribbean and Latin America, but it would also stand on the front lines of climate change and rising sea levels. Fourth, the Northeastern Union, also called the Republic of Acela, stretching from Boston to Washington, D.C. This state would dominate Wall Street, where the market capitalization of the New York Stock Exchange alone exceeds $25 trillion. This would give it enormous leverage over global finance. However, it would depend almost entirely on imports of food and energy. Fifth, the Heartland Federation, comprising the Midwest and the Great Plains. This is the breadbasket of the world, producing more than 75% of America's corn and soybeans. Their control over food would be their strongest geopolitical weapon. The collapse of America will not remain within its borders. It is a geopolitical earthquake that will unleash a tsunami of chaos across every continent. First, neighbors in the eye of the storm, North America and Latin America. For America's neighbors, this collapse is not a distant event. It is an earthquake happening in their own living room. Canada and Mexico. These two countries would face an existential nightmare. Their economies depend almost entirely on trade with the United States. With the American market collapsing, their economies would implode overnight. But the greater threat would be a refugee crisis. Imagine millions of desperate Americans fleeing north into Canada and south into Mexico. Canada, with a population of just 40 million, would be crushed under this human wave. Meanwhile, the Mexican border would descend into chaos, controlled by cartels that would grow stronger than ever in the absence of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration. Latin America, it would be a humanitarian catastrophe. Remittances from migrants in the United States, the lifeline of economies in El Salvador and Honduras, would suddenly stop. This would plunge millions into extreme poverty. Dollarized economies such as Ecuador and Panama would face a complete economic collapse. Into this vacuum, China would step in, tightening its grip on the region. At the same time, countries like Colombia and Mexico could transform into true narco-states, where cartel power surpasses the authority of the state itself. Second, Europe, the end of an era and the beginning of fear. In Europe, the echoes of America's collapse will ring loudly. NATO, which has relied on American power for decades, will face the risk of disintegration, and the continent will confront a moment of truth. The European Union will face an existential choice: either unify militarily or fragment. Germany, with its economic strength, would be forced to fund a real European army. The French nuclear arsenal would become Europe's only nuclear umbrella. But can 27 countries with diverging interests agree on a unified defense policy in the face of a resurgent Russia? Most likely, internal divisions will deepen as some states seek alliances with Russia, while Eastern European countries live in constant fear. For the isolated United Kingdom, having left the European Union, the situation would be catastrophic. Its special relationship with Washington would vanish. It would find itself a medium-sized island, diplomatically and economically isolated, caught between a turbulent European continent and a global power vacuum. Third, Asia, a new nuclear arms race. In Asia, where the American presence has long been the cornerstone of stability, chaos will erupt. Japan and South Korea, these two allies would suddenly find themselves exposed to an assertive China and an unpredictable North Korea. Without American security guarantees, their only option for survival would be to develop their own nuclear weapons. Both possess the technological capability to do so rapidly. The nuclear nightmare that America has sought to prevent in Asia for decades would become reality, triggering a terrifying regional arms race. India, the rising power, would find itself in a difficult position. It has long relied on its relationship with the United States to balance China's influence. Now, it would have to confront the Chinese dragon alone. A conflict with its historical nuclear rival, Pakistan, could also emerge, pushing India to accelerate its military program massively and form new alliances with other regional powers like Australia and Japan. However, without the weight of the United States, this alliance would be far weaker. Fourth, Africa, the forgotten continent in the eye of the storm. The impact of America's collapse on Africa would be silent, yet no less deadly. Vital aid programs would stop. Programs like PEPFAR, which have saved millions of lives in the fight against AIDS, would collapse. Food assistance from the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, would halt, threatening widespread famine from the Horn of Africa to the Sahel region. The U.S. military leadership in Africa, AFRICOM, would disappear. Without American support in intelligence and drones, fragile national armies in the Sahel would collapse. Groups such as Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS would find their golden age, seizing vast territories and potentially leading to the disintegration of entire countries, like Mali and Burkina Faso. Other powers would rush to fill the vacuum. China would use its debt-trap diplomacy to seize natural resources and control ports. Russia, through its mercenaries, would expand its security for resources model, backing military coups in exchange for gold and diamonds. European powers, like France, would find themselves powerless to protect their interests without American support. Economic collapse, a depression worse than 1929. The collapse is not just a recession, it is the complete evaporation of the system. First, the death of the US dollar. Imagine waking up to find that the world's reserve currency, the US dollar, has become worthless. Everything priced in dollars, from oil to wheat, would suddenly lose all meaning. Trillions of dollars held by central banks in China, Japan, and Saudi Arabia would turn into mere digital dust. The new nations emerging from America's collapse would spiral into hyperinflation, and global currency markets would descend into chaos in a desperate attempt to find a replacement. Is it the euro, the yuan, gold? There is no ready alternative, and this is the essence of the disaster. Second, the evaporation of global wealth. The foundation of the global financial system is not gold, but U.S. Treasury bonds, the so-called safest asset in the world. With the federal government disintegrating, it would default on tens of trillions in debt. This would wipe out wealth held in pension funds, insurance companies, and government and private portfolios around the world. It would be the greatest destruction of wealth in human history, leading to a complete paralysis of credit markets. No banks would lend, and no companies could borrow. Third, the halt of global trade. The American consumer, the world's final buyer, would simply disappear. Who would buy German cars, Chinese electronics, or Vietnamese clothing? A global wave of bankruptcies would sweep the world from Stuttgart to Shenzhen. Meanwhile, America's vital exports would stop. The world's breadbasket, the heartland states, would close its doors, causing famine and food crisis in countries dependent on wheat and corn imports. Global supply chains would collapse, and the world would return to an era of extreme protectionism, as each country builds walls around its economy to survive. The scenario of the United States breaking apart is neither inevitable nor desirable, but it is no longer impossible. It is a warning that nations, no matter how powerful they seem, are ultimately ideas that live in the minds of their citizens. And when the idea of unity and shared destiny dies, physical maps begin to fade. The challenge facing America today is a challenge facing the entire world. Can our deeply polarized societies find a new story to unite them, or are the forces of division stronger than the bonds of union? The answer to this question will not only determine the future of 330 million Americans, but will also shape the global order for decades to come. It is a new world order built on the ruins of the old system, a world where the dollar dies and wealth evaporates, a world where not only the economy collapses, but the system that has governed the planet for decades crumbles. And if this is the earthquake at the center of the great power, what will the aftershocks look like in the most sensitive and volatile regions of the world? In the next episode, we turn to the Middle East. We will discover how the death of the petrodollar will affect the kingdoms built upon it, and how ruling regimes will act when they suddenly find themselves without American protection. At the heart of this chaos, we will ask, what is the fate of the Kurds? A people whose destiny has long been tied to international alliances. What will happen when the largest player disappears, leaving them alone against enemies lying in wait? Join us in the next episode to see how the map of the Middle East will be redrawn, not in ink, but in blood and fire.